just going to be sort of briefly introducing what's going to be going on tonight. Going to be talking about Philosemitism, the problem of. It's kind of a thorny problem. It's a thorny issue. So obviously, you know, in the chat, in any discussion, you know, everybody conduct yourselves sort of respectfully and in a comradely way. That would be really, really great. Just obviously no, don't use any ableist language, don't use any transphobic language, don't use any racist language, and just be cool dudes. That would be really, really good. We're going to do our best to kind of like moderate things and make sure that nobody is an uncool dude, let's say. But yeah, if you could all help us out with that, that would be great. I'm just really briefly going to introduce all the speakers that we have tonight, and then I'll get off so interesting people can talk. So Tom Gann's going to be chairing. He'll be using this screen. He's obviously the other editor of New Socialist. And then in, I think, the order that we decided, we're going to have Kieran, better known as at Decolonial Commie on Twitter, king of the reading groups, who'll just be kind of giving a brief intro and sort of framing everything for us, and, you know, generally being rad. Then we're going to have Michael Richmond, who has apparently written, I think, what Alana described as a short book to share with us also. That's pretty exciting. I'm stoked for that. After that, I think we were going to have, was it Anna coming next? Is that right? Dr. Anna Esteunas. Anna is an incredibly accomplished person, an independent researcher, researching critical race theories and psychoanalysis, specifically in the context of Germany, Europe, and the EU. She's going to be sharing her perspective around that, which is going to be really great. Then we'll have Avia who researches at Birkbeck, but also I think is probably well known to most of us in Britain anyway as an absolutely amazing organiser. Part of Sisters Uncut, very active in Kill the Bill, very active in the opposition to the policing bill, and is going to be talking a little bit about the experience of being Black and Jewish and the ways in which the various kinds of racisms we're going to be discussing intersect and sort of crystallise around that identity. And then, last but not least, we have Alana Lentin, author of Why Race Still Matters. Hopefully you've all read the excellent interview that she did with Salim Nadi on New Socialist. Alana is a professor, quite recently a professor, well-deserved, of cultural and social analysis at Western Sydney University, working on race, racism and anti-racism in a critical theoretical perspective. Yeah, those are the guys. And I'm going to hand you over to Tom now, our chair.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I think this should be like a really good and important event. I'm just going to pass on to Kieran in a second, and then maybe come back and speak a little more to set up the discussion. But if there are things, obviously, that strike people while our speakers are talking, definitely go and put that in the chat, and I can take a look at that and feed that into the discussion. Or, yeah, if people have questions after that, we can sort that out instead. So, yeah, without further ado, let's move on to Kieran to start us off properly. Thanks, Kieran.
Yeah, it's not, the unmute thing isn't working. Can you unmute yourself, Kieran? Is it not letting you? That's really annoying.
Right click on Kieran's name. Yeah, or try and
yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, lovely. Where is it? I can see lots of people, but not Kieran, weirdly. Oh, I know why.
Brilliant. Awesome. I'm free.
We got there in the end. Right. Thank you and sorry.
No, thanks, comrades. Thanks for everybody for coming to what I think hopefully be a really interesting and generative event. Also, just want to say thank you to all the speakers for coming up and for taking time, because this was the original idea that I posed to Alana, and she was like, this is great. And also to New Socialist for basically allowing the space for something like this to happen, because as people will know who attend my reading groups, I think the idea of collective kind of pedagogy is really powerful, and is something which we should kind of, is much more informative and much more generative for us all to kind of collectively come together on this stuff, and kind of work out things that are both complex and also uncomfortable in some ways, but to do that in a collective space of solidarity, I think is really powerful. So I first came to this idea of obviously issues of philosemitic anti-Semitism that we're seeing, the political discourses around it, some of the kind of social policies in terms of things like the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and stuff. And just to give a bit of background, I originally asked Lana, have you done anything on this specifically? And she was like, well, I've done some stuff, but I'd like to speak back in a space like this. So I've written a small thing just talking about the general framing that I kind of put to Alana and Tom and Josie. So as an activist on Palestine, the operationalisation of anti-Semitism is obviously not new. And I think sometimes people put it down more to recent events rather than a much longer history. The operationalisation of anti-Semitism against Palestinians and broadly more anti-Zionist forces. But I think what gets missed and what is actually more important, and I think this links into the broader proliferation of what we can understand as what I would term like the operationalisation of anti-Semitism today, from European states, Anglo-settler states, and even far-right movements, is why has it been so effective in Europe and the West, in undermining both the struggle to liberate Palestine, but also undermining the power of contemporary left and anti-racist forces, right? And that's why we're here, to develop forms of political practice that we can engage with this on. So for me, one of the main kind of themes that has run through has been Aimé Césaire's kind of short work, Discourse on Colonialism, where, speaking of, well, not to these issues, but I think I consider them as like a precursor to what has been developed into this kind of like philosemitism, you might say, where he says, yes, it would be worthwhile to study clinically in detail the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism, and to reveal to the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century that without his being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon, that if he rails against him, he is being inconsistent, and that at bottom, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa. So for me, this is where my understanding of the development of contemporary philosemitic anti-Semitism emerges. And its operationalization both against Palestinian liberation, but also more radical social forces, which actually threaten the legitimacy and conception of self of not only Britain, but more broadly Europe, and its conception of European modernity as this liberal kind of enlightenment project, right? Those forces that threaten it are black radical uprisings that we're seeing, anti-racist organizing, radical feminist or abolitionism that we're seeing with Kill the Bill and Sisters Uncut. These solidarities between communities which racial capitalism not only requires but purposefully manufactures these oppositions and differences. That these solidarities being forged and these forms of anti-racist forces threaten European colonial modernity, let alone England and Britain itself. And I think it's here where we can start to understand what I'd say is the deeper phenomenology, that is the deeper ideological relations that constitute the ability for fascists, let's get this right, for fascists, to be able to call either Palestinian activists anti-Semites or anti-Zionist Jews self-hating, so as to deflect from the racist crimes and complicities of the British state. So this is the threat that collective anti-racist forces pose to these powers, and that the project to operationalize anti-Semitism through Philosemitism, this love of Jewish people, is rooted in this need to deny the material, historical, and ideological elements which actually maintain and reproduce British society. Those are the dialectics of difference, violence, racism, and dehumanization. So that's where, for those of you who follow me, may have seen me constantly reaching for the Simpsons meme, which I've taken drawing from Alana's work. And I feel like I have to have it permanently stamped on my head now with all of the kind of current discourse. Quoting Alana's most piercing analysis in the last chapter of her book, Why Race Still Matters, the chapter entitled Good Jew, Bad Jew, where she says, the political utility of anti-Semitism today is not to illuminate the operations of race, but rather to obscure them. The severing of race as a technology of rule from frozen accounts of racism has precipitated a public illiteracy about how race works that presents a serious challenge to anti-racism. And I think it's the first part that at least speaks to me more, that it works not to illuminate, but to obscure the operations of race and anti-Semitism. So to finish up, because I hate the sound of my own voice and everyone else is more interested in me, it is this challenge that must be confronted honestly, and where we must collectively develop critical consciousness of what anti-Semitism and therefore what race is, its logics, its epistemology, its rationalizations, and I would also say its global system of reproduction, that is racial capitalism, so that we can develop forms of transformative praxis so that we may effectively advance a powerful anti-Zionism as well as a radical anti-racism that sees clearly and works to illuminate through action the operations and links between anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, Zionism, and the broader tapestry of racist and white supremacist oppression globally. That's me done.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Kieran. That was great, and I think really useful kind of framing of what we're kind of interested in exploring here. So moving on now, I think we have Mike next to give, I think, like a kind of critical and historical overview of aspects of this question. So that should be really good. So yeah, if we move on to Mike.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so like Josie said, I wrote way too many notes, and but now I kind of know vaguely what other people are going to say. I think I'll just stick to giving a bit of a kind of deeper history, maybe of Philosemitism, some examples of it from kind of medieval, early modern periods, and then kind of 19th century, just as a way to then maybe look at how there are parallels in the structure of these kinds of relations to the kinds of contemporary Philosemitism that we've become maybe more familiar with now. So I think the first thing we have to do to understand Philosemitism as a phenomenon is to understand that it comes from a context, from a relationship of domination that is Jews living in proximity and under the power of Christians and Gentiles in Europe for many centuries. And you have different forms of domination with sort of, I guess, what Pistone called Judeophobia. And then there's a reason why he gives a different term towards the more kind of racial technology of anti-Semitism. But you have a kind of a dominant religious kind of bigotry where Jews, because of religious doctrine and usury laws, are circumscribed within the division of labor to only be able to do certain jobs, to have to live in ghettos where there's restrictions on movement and mixing with Gentiles. You have, as an example of a kind of early Philosemitism, you have like favorites, you know, kind of court Jews you might have heard of. These are kind of early modern bankers or moneylenders to Christian rulers in various European, kind of early European states, where these Jews would have privileges over other Jews and over many Christian subjects. They would be allowed out to operate outside of the ghetto, to not have to wear the Star of David. So they were favored in that way, but their existence was also precarious. They may have been a favorite of a certain ruler, but if when that ruler dies, they could easily be ditched or killed by the next. Christian rulers could choose just not to repay their debts. So it kind of points up a sort of an early form of racism that can operate as exclusion in the ghetto, or as a kind of exposure or hypervisibility. Then later on, if we talk about the kind of what's called the emancipation, so Jews kind of being more integrated, given civil rights into like European societies. Over the course of the 19th century in Britain, Jews gradually are able to enter into the professions and become members of the ruling class. But this kind of liberal freedom is double-edged, because it coincides with this kind of intensified era of racial ideologies. So Jews at this time become much more sort of fixedly racialized, made alien, abstract, rootless, kind of thought to personify modernity, seen as corrupting influences on states and kind of governments, and scapegoated by emerging European nationalisms, particularly newer ones like Germany and Italy in the late 19th century. So Jews as a kind of primary minority in this period in European societies are a minority that the nation can be defined against. In like kind of 19th century British Philosemitism, it's a minority thing, you know, anti-Semitism is more dominant, but they're kind of mobilized around like causes, sort of groups and protests are put together to defend Jews abroad, raising like funds and petitioning and lobbying for diplomacy for Jews who have been subjected to pogroms or blood libels in Eastern Europe, or there's the famous one in Damascus in the 1840s. And this is where kind of Jews and non-Jewish elites in Britain condemn such practices. But linked to what Kieran's talking about, of course, similar racial violence was long deployed against Jews in Britain historically, but it's also coterminously being deployed against racialized people in colonies and within Britain, especially in the early 20th century. So Philosemites are often early supporters of Zionism in the early 19th century. And this kind of Philosemitic Zionism is very popular among the colonial elite and in settler colonies. Many of the kind of leading Gentile Zionists leading up to sort of the Balfour Declaration are deeply anti-Semitic statesmen, people like Churchill, Lloyd George, Balfour, Lord Alfred Milner, who was the main funder of the British Workers' League, which is a kind of patriotic labour group that's basically like a kind of anti-Semitic sort of street group, pro World War One, fighting against socialists but also beating up Jews. So I think just to finish up, these things are most often based on the assumption that anti-Semitism no longer existed in Britain, that it was eradicated by either the end of the Edict of Expulsion, or because by 1858, a Jewish MP was sitting in the Commons. So anti-Semitism was viewed by Philosemites as being happening in uncivilized places, including rival powers, like with the Dreyfus affair in France. You have many waves of kind of middle and upper class Philosemitism in the late 19th, early 20th century, which happens over liberal, conservative, Christian, secular traditions, where groups kind of, embrace the Jews as a kind of figuration, while also celebrating British tolerance. So I think we can recognize some parallels there. I think a big problem with Philosemitism has been that there's been a tendency, including among Jews, to earnestly affirm the philo in Philosemitism, to ignore or welcome the racial stereotypes that come with it. These kind of eugenic celebrations of Jewish genius or even power, putting like a positive spin on conspiracies and racializations. I think there's often very clear instrumental strategic motives as to why Jews were being loved, why Zionism was being supported. Many Philosemites were just wanting to convert Jews, or there were economic or nationalist or imperialist overlaps, or Jews were put in the position as being a kind of model minority. A kind of our Jews was written about a lot by Gentiles in the 19th century. And this was partly used to put down other groups, for example, Catholics, as being, why can't you be more like the Jews? So yeah, I think underlining that, I've got a lot of other stuff written down that I won't bring in, but I think it's to say Philosemitism has always been appropriation, not solidarity.
Thanks, Mike. That was great and really important. So we'll move on now to Anna Esther-Younis, who I think this is going to be really valuable as well, giving a kind of wider context beyond Britain, thinking about Germany and the EU. So Anna, moving on to Anna then.
Well, yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me, especially to Alana and the organizers of the New Socialist. I'm going to be talking about the IRA definition and how it unfolded in Germany as of today, as well as on the European level in the second step since the year 2000. Before I'm going to do this, I wanted to say something to what Michael said before and the anti-Semitic uproars, I guess, or anti-Semitic events in Damascus. There's a wonderful book by Jonathan Frankel. It's called The Damascus Affair, and it was actually quite a colonial French intervention back then. So yeah. Anyway, so Germany, as I've published elsewhere, anti-Semitism policies followed in the wake of the War on Terror and primarily deployed a language of prevention and punishment, as well as a racializing rhetoric such as Muslim carrier groups, North African and Middle Eastern anti-Semitism breeding grounds, or Muslim anti-Semitism. Around 10 years into the War on Terror, BDS or Palestinian human rights activism has either become entirely suspicious or been labeled as anti-Semitic or terrorist in Germany. Incitements to such discourse came along with a change in citizenship law in the year 2000, which allowed non-white German subjects to become national citizens. B, the Second Intifada in Israel and Palestine, which divided the German left even further on the one hand, whilst fostering the idea of a genuine Palestinian anti-Semitism in society on the other hand. Lastly, C, it was the beginning of the War on Terror in 2001, which fueled media and discursive practices of Orientalism, the secret share of anti-Semitism, as Edward Said called it. Today's German policy proposals to evict anti-Semitic refugees, as well as issue travel bans or the cancellation of residency permits, were accelerated by the so-called European refugee crisis in late 2015, yet were present in discourse before, as Kieran already mentioned. As I have also published, Germany today employs 14 federal state anti-Semitism delegates out of 16 federal states, one anti-Semitism delegate of the government, Dr. Felix Klein, and one special representative at the Foreign Ministry for Anti-Semitism and Jewish Organizations. The IRA permanent office is situated in Berlin, and for the year 2020 to 21, the envoy of the German Foreign Ministry also serves as the chair of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, in short, IRA. On the European level, it is the German Katharina von Schnurbein, who was appointed the first European Commission coordinator on combating anti-Semitism in December 2015. Just a week ago, in fact, the German Federal and State Commission to Fight Anti-Semitism and Preserve Jewish Life, which is an umbrella organization which combines all anti-Semitism delegates, has decided to strengthen the education and training of judges, prosecutors, and other members of the judiciary. The commissioners also call for the establishment and distribution of set guidelines to better identify anti-Semitic crimes for public prosecutors in all German states. The government's anti-Semitism delegate, Dr. Felix Klein, already stated, and I quote, "We have agreed to ask the federal and state ministers of justice to work towards appointing anti-Semitism officers at the public prosecutors' offices, general as well as federal." End of quote. It should be noted that the IRA working definition in Germany is already being studied as part of the curriculum of the Federal Criminal Police Force's bachelor's degree courses in Germany. To give you an example of what we're discussing today, of the public engagement of these anti-Semitism delegates, I would like to give a few examples. One from 2019, where Professor Dr. Salzborn, Berlin's anti-Semitism delegate, tweeted that the P word in public is a reason to revolt. I quote, "When people at the next table on the train start bringing up Palestine as a topic for no reason at all, it's either time to get off, put on headphones, or yell at them. Anti-Semitism," end of quote. In June 21, the anti-Semitism delegate of Baden-Württemberg, Mr. Blume, proposed that the Jewish Voice for Peace in the Middle East Twitter account is, I quote, "a fake, pretend Jewish Twitter account," end of quote. Since 2008, various definitions, federal or national parliamentary motions or government policies have been drafted around anti-Semitism. It's linked to Islam, the Muslim world, terrorism, and the geopolitics of the Middle East and Africa writ large. In 2019, the German parliament issued a non-binding and non-legal anti-BDS motion, which has by now been adopted by courts, local municipalities, universities, as well as civil society organizations, including anti-racism organizations, which rely partly or fully on state funding in this country. In 2019, 1 month after the live-streamed white supremacist murder spree against a synagogue and a donor shop, the German Federation of University Chancellors made a public statement condemning anti-Semitism in relation to the events and adopted the IRA definition for German campuses, declaring BDS anti-Semitic. It was signed by almost 2,000 university employees. Such a paradoxical reaction, which conflates a human rights-led movement by Palestinians with conservative German forces of white supremacy, is symptomatic of a wider social dynamic. Anti-Semitic events such as these have doubled up on anti-Muslim racism and on anti-racist activism and scholarship that is broadly related to decolonial and queer feminist perspectives. Such developments ought to be read within a broader social trend in Western societies writ large, with France and the Islamo-Gauchisme accusations against academics as just one example. Now I'm going to move to the European level. The organization that has gathered a secret file about me and my scholarship by now, sending it to political parties to get me disinvited from events, for instance, is called RIAS, and is one, amongst other things, is an organization which is, amongst other things, funded by the Senate Department for Justice in Berlin. RIAS has 8 offices in Germany and one headquarter, just like IRA has its permanent office in Berlin. Rias is well connected to every anti-Semitism delegate, federal as well as national and EU-wide. Rias also keeps close ties to the EU and to Katharina von Schnurbein. Indeed, 2020 to 21 was the year where most official EU positions dealing with anti-Semitism, either directly or remotely, were run or occupied by white Germans, non-Jewish white Germans. Indeed, as Balibar once mentioned, Berlin has become the new capital of Europe, and with it also the capital of anti-Semitism policies in Europe. Since 2017, the European Commission has been using the IRA definition as a practical guidance tool and intends to use it further. The IRA definition is not legally binding, nor does it replace existing legislation on crime or discrimination, at least that's how they're framing it. However, it directly influences decision-making and has material consequences, which is essentially denied in public statements by the EU or Germany throughout. To date, 18 EU member states out of 27 have adopted the IRA definition. The European Parliament adopted it in 2017. The references to IRA are included in the 2018 and 2020 European Council declarations on anti-Semitism. It should be noted that the people who have been busy promoting the what we call today IRA working definition since 2000 are also the same people involved in writing up the EU Commission's handbook on anti-Semitism. The working definition of anti-Semitism, however, has only been adopted by IRA members for its short definition, which defines anti-Semitism as, I quote, a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews, rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities, end of quote. None of the examples, however, used in the handbook nor in public representations have actually officially been adopted by any of the member states of IRA in Bucharest in 2016. One can thus summarize that, in fact, every government or policy stakeholder has amended and added to this definition the examples that they found important to include for their own constituency, including Germany, in fact. According to the ELSC, the EU Commission's handbook thus knowingly misinforms the public about political processes and content, equates anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, and cites as best practice example the calling Israel a racist endeavor as an inherently anti-Semitic trend. The handbook as well focuses primarily on law enforcement, the judiciary, educational ventures and institutions, funding by public policy stakeholders and civil society. Before finishing, I'm sorry I'm talking a lot, I want to add something about funding. Funding also receives special notice in the European Commission's handbook from page 30 onward. In Germany, the bank account of the Jewish Voice for Peace has already been cancelled based on their based on their support for BDS. However, the freezing and persecution of private or NGO funds to the Middle East has been surveilled, has been happening ever since the war on terror began, and the freezing of bank accounts is nothing new. With the recent criminalization of several Palestinian civil society organizations, the control of financial means and money as a means to manage and tame collectives as well has also been pointed out by Yara Shafani. She writes in the news analysis online section of the Journal of Palestine Studies, and I quote, 49 out of 50 largest banks in the world use the same World Check Risk Intelligence record, which lists approximately 2.7 million names and organizations, with 93,000 designated as terrorists. If the US alone follows Israel's suit and takes steps to criminalize these organizations, global banks will likely close pertinent overseas accounts. End of quote. Conclusion, I'm almost done. The discourse I so shortly and only in small parts detailed weaponizes the figure of the Jew for national security purposes and the politics of national and European white identity. I would like to introduce a way of thinking about said manifestations that troubles easy binaries between a memory politics gone wrong or an anti-racism policy in need of decolonization. I would like to think with you about said manifestations as a European follow-up war to the war on drugs and the war on terror, embedded firmly within liberal structures of ruling, humanitarianism, educational civilizing missions, and material incarceration tactics. I'm here thinking with Angela Davis, Elena Lentin, or others, or in particular Lisa Lowe, who who all see the war on terror as a colonially constituted continuous war fought against the colonized and enslaved in a larger circuit of racial capitalism and liberalism, mitigating between phantasmatic borderlines that ostensibly keep Islamists, communists, or anti-Semites out of Europe or out of European structures of representation and power. What I thus call the war on anti-Semitism signals Europe's re-entry to official global racial politics, where racialized populations, in particular those framed as Muslim and Black, are publicly attested in unfitness for European cohabitation and democracy and are marked for dispossession. This war is an assemblage of policies about national belonging, propelled by desires for material security and fueled by white racial anxieties, providing a logic for the management of non-white migration and life in an ethnically diverse yet white supremacist Europe. Methods deployed are policing and surveillance, economic exclusion and dispossession, criminalization, incarceration, and possible legal evictions from Germany or other states, which is precisely why it resembles older colonial and racial forms of rule. Additionally, inside European territory, we witness an occupational ban within structures funded directly or indirectly by nation states. Here, most not noteworthy to name are Germany and France and England, in fact. Finally, such war makes use of racializing the figurations of the Semite by racializing Jewishness and Muslimness, yet to different means and ends. Edward Said called Orientalism the secret share of anti-Semitism. With what I have presented to you so far, I would like to call the war on anti-Semitism the secret share of the war on terror, which features war making as well as war prevention. My short presentation and naming of a phenomenon intends to open an investigation, as Lisa Law writes, I quote, and wants to contribute to a manner of reading and interpretation and not to identify an empirically grounded, foundation or establish a new historical subject. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. I think that was really important and valuable in drawing out those kind of relations and articulations of anti-Semitism. We are having some slight problems with trying to sort out captions. I think everything should be enabled our end, but we're trying our best to get that sorted. Hopefully we can sort something with that. But yeah, so we've got Avia next, who's from Black Jewish Alliance, who's going to be further contributing to some of these questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to speak a little bit about sort of the different roles different racisms play in racial capitalism. And I think especially kind of interesting and important to be thinking about that if you saw some of the stuff that was happening on Twitter over the last few days, over the Jewish Chronicle, sort of claiming that Jews were not allowed into a meeting for people of color, trying to make out, that this is like an anti-Semitic meeting and had left Jews off the table, obviously leaving out the fact that Black Jews and Jews of color would be allowed to attend that meeting, the furore that came out of that. And I think it's quite interesting to think about what's going on politically at the moment around some of these issues. As someone who's both Black and Jewish, I've grown up considering quite deeply the connection between anti-Semitism and racism, other kinds of racism. As someone who's sort of descended from a Holocaust survivor and descended from slaves, growing up trying to grapple with that history and seeing that sort of intergenerational trauma that's been left through my immediate family, and kind of been left with thinking about and reflecting and considering a lot of these issues, and spent a lot of my time really reflecting on them. I think in practice, I think it's important to think in terms of analysis that actually recognizes the links between anti-Semitism and racism, such as anti-Black racism more broadly, and what purposes they serve within racial capitalism. the way I see racism towards Jews and the racism towards Black people is that they both play particular roles, and that they're utilized, and that they often, sort of reinforce each other. And, Jews, Black people, as well as Black Jews, all experience racial capitalism in ways that can be distinct, but that can also sort of overlap, whether they're being, we're being exploited to accumulate wealth or thrown under the bus to protect capital. And regardless of where Jews actually sit in that class structure, myths have always, and we've heard this from Mike and others, have always, and continue to be pushed, this idea that Jews are supposedly never exploited, only exploiters, antithetical to working class interests, and responsible for undermining the conditions of the working classes. Black people, on the other hand, kind of categorized as subhuman in order to justify that, super exploitation through slavery, and then the kind of racialized, post-slavery, the racialized as the lowest class in society, through significant violence, while being kept in the most precarious position in society to be pulled into the market when needed and disposed of a surplus when not. And those tropes that have developed by, the establishment, to historically deflect attention away from themselves and onto, these like racialized groups, have been utilized again and again by the establishment, maybe with slightly different tones sometimes, but, and slightly different emphasis, but, some of the same old stuff. And one of the things that, I think is quite interesting, for me, like having experience in both the Black community and the mostly Ashkenazi Jewish community, white Ashkenazi Jewish community, how this essentially plays out, and how those divide and rule sort of strategies actually play out in communities, I think is quite interesting. And what's happening today, I think, in terms of elite Philosemitism and how that's playing out, I think is quite interesting. So, the kind of performative so-called solidarity that you see with anti-Semitism, has real deep material consequences. When Lisa Nandy refers to anti-Semitism as punching up and perpetuates the myth that Jews are up there for, above everyone else, or when John McTernan argues that to be anti-capitalist is to be anti-Semitic, he's dealing in a lot of these old tropes that Jews are the capitalists, perpetuating this idea that, quite neatly, that, that protects the establishment come what may. And I think, one of the things, that I think is really interesting about that is what that then does to communities and their understanding of who Jews are and what role they play in our society. I remember when the presenter Reggie Yates made reference to fat North London Jews managing Black musicians. It became incredibly difficult, as in a lot of Black, Facebook groups, political Facebook groups, and getting people to understand that Jews who are in positions to materially exploit people do that through their whiteness, not through their Jewishness, was actually almost impossible to get people to understand the differences between those things. And the state philosemitism that comes out perpetuates and feeds that idea that if you're feeling exploited, if someone's taking your money, or if they're exploiting, your landlord's exploiting you, it's because they're Jewish, it's not because they're white. And anti-Blackness, of course, has a very long history in the Jewish community and white Ashkenazi Jewish communities, as does solidarity between Jews and Black people. But I think that the state of Israel has played a particular role in intensifying massively racism within different Jewish communities, between Jews of color, between Black Jews and other Jews, as well as towards those who are not Jewish, through the racist dispossession of Palestinians. So my mum somewhat grew up in Israel, and actually both my parents are Black and Jewish. My dad's Jewish by choice. My mum was born into is mixed race, born into an Ashkenazi family. and my mum was taken to Israel as a teenager, and the Zionist project that was on offer for my grandma as a working class Ashkenazi East End Jew, my mum very quickly and very violently found out was not including her as a mixed race, and she's also disabled, she's autistic, that the state of Israel and the Zionist project was not for her. And the way in which the Ashkenazi supremacy, how it operates both towards those who are not Jewish and also within Jewish communities, has violently torn families, communities apart to perpetuate that the colonial project. And I kind of just want to finish though on a bit of a more of a positive note, because I do think that it is possible to organize against this, and we do have tools at our disposal to organize against racial capitalism and the things that are being told to us that try to divide us. One example is the sort of labor organizing of the International Ladies Garment Workers in New York, back in the 30s. And it was a union branch that had traditionally been Jewish, an Ashkenazi Jewish union. Usually the meetings were carried out in Yiddish, but the bosses attempted to exploit racial divisions by pulling in Black workers as scabs. And then the response was not to entrench that racial division, but was actually to organize both the Jewish community and the Black community together. And before you knew it, you had 30,000 people, Black and Jewish people, uprising together, demanding a 35-hour working week. I think that there are other examples of this where those racial divisions that tried to be exploited by bosses or by the state or by the elite, time and time again, there are examples where organizing based on solidarity and understanding what those tools are and what they do and what they're trying to do to us, we do actually have solidarity at our disposal to fight against that. So I kind of just wanted to end on that, hopefully more positive note.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And I think this is like a really important kind of argument and point to make as well, that things are not necessarily completely bleak, that there are capacities to organize against these kinds of fragmentation and division. And thank you so much. And then coming on to then to kind of finish off this bit before we open up for discussion, we've got Alana Lenton to finish off this bit. So Alana.
Thanks everybody. Just let me begin first by saying that I'm with you today, talking to you from unceded Gadigal land. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge that where I am sitting and all of so-called Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm really thankful to everybody for being here today. We started a conversation with Josie, Tom and Kieran about having such an event, and I really couldn't hope for more brilliant people to be sharing this space with. Some of the people here, or all of you, have taught me immeasurably. And the way I've come to think about the questions that we're dealing with today really are through the conversations that I've had with all of you over the last little while. And I've put together something which is a shorter version of a talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago that poor Anna has already listened to. But it's interesting because it took place in the context of a German conference on migration, race and migration. And I think my intention was really to have them think about the problems inherent in kind of avoiding the problem of particularly anti-Palestinian racism and the exclusion of Palestinian academics. It was an academic conference such as Anna and others. And it was really, well, interesting is a euphemism always, isn't it? But it was really interesting how they sort of just circumvented the critique they just didn't listen to it at all. And we had subsequent conversations with the organizers where I was asking them can you actually address the criticisms of the German war on anti-Semitism that I made in my talk? And they just pretended that I hadn't said that, right? So it's really interesting how the point that I was making was that as a Jewish person, I was permitted to make these critiques. A Palestinian person would not have been permitted to make them, but at the same time, the critiques fell on, they didn't want to listen to them. So that was something that I think, made me think a little bit about how I began the talk, right? So I began the talk by talking about how, and some of you have probably read this, a blog post that I wrote last year, where I wrote that I don't want to hear the words as a Jew anymore. Okay, I don't want to hear the words as a Jew. I came up with this in sort of frustration against what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah. And I said that I was tired of the Zionist manipulation of biblical mythology to justify the violent occupation of another people's land. But I was also tired of the constant appeal from our side, if you like, or from progressive Jews to the so-called Jewish tradition to legitimize anti-Zionist Jews who support Palestinian liberation. But in thinking about what we're going to be speaking about today, I'm reflecting on those very words, not just the words. I still stand by the words, okay? But I'm really uncomfortable with the way in which they were taken up, almost gleefully by many people. Here is a Jewish person saying that she doesn't want to speak as a Jew anymore. And the subtext to this was that I don't want to be used either as a Jew, okay? I remember a few years ago receiving an email from somebody who'd heard me speak about the anti-Semitism of Zionism, which is a talk that I gave, or the anti-Semitism of state Philosemitism and Zionism. And he said, we need a Jewish socialist woman for our panel. And I turned around to him, I wrote back in my email and I said, well, I'm not going to tick those boxes for you. If you're interested in what I have to say, that's one thing, but I'm not your Jewish socialist woman who you need for your panel, right? And he never wrote back to me again. So there's a lot of silence, which also in relation to the German conference that I think, I'm sitting in this discomfort constantly, and I want to air that and address that openly. So that's just by form of prelude, but I don't want to take up too long. I just want to say a few things that I wrote about in my book that Kieran mentioned before, the fourth chapter of Why Race Still Matters, which is called Good Jew, Bad Jew. And in it, I look at how anti-Semitism has been made exceptional and why I think that it's bad for anti-racism. So I think the urgent motivations for talking about these things are, of course, what Anna Esther Yunus calls the war on anti-Semitism and how that's being used to attack anti-colonial activists, artists, and academics, as we saw, for example, in the recent case of Somdeep Sen's, disinvitation, if you can call it that, from Glasgow University. But beyond this, kind of also really important to mention less high-profile people, including students, who are being threatened for their activism or simply for being Palestinian on campus. Anna spoke about the IHRA definition or working definition of anti-Semitism, but I also don't think that the Jerusalem Declaration is beyond critique, and maybe we can talk about that in the conversation later. My basic point about the whole idea of definitions is that I don't think we need a definition of anti-Semitism, especially not one that's separated out from other forms of racism, particularly because the politics around the war on anti-Semitism sets it up as an exceptional form of racism, and it is suggested a more nefarious form or an older form and therefore more nefarious or the originary form of racism around which all other racisms need to be organized. And I think that's ahistorical and unhelpful, but it's also unhelpful in terms of resistance and activism and solidarity building. At the same time, I think it's important to note that anti-Semitism does pose a threat, particularly perhaps, it ebbs and flows, right? But I think particularly in the era of COVID, I think it is something that's on the rise. But as always has been the case with anti-Semitism, the threat predominantly comes from elites. So while thinking about the growth of anti-Semitism, I'm particularly interested in thinking about how I, as a white European Jewish woman who was born on occupied Palestinian land and who currently lives on the still colonized land of the Gadigal people, can act against it from an anti-colonial standpoint. And I don't see that fight as separate, different, or more important than the struggle against racism in general. So the anti-Semitism of mainstream institutions, including most politicians, media figures, and of course the official Jewish community, and Avia spoke about the Jewish Chronicle, and I think their role in this, particularly in the UK, is, out of proportion. This anti-Semitism has, I've argued, been turned into a proxy for anti-racism. In my book, I wrote, in the present moment, publicly performing opposition to anti-Semitism and support for Israel, the two having been made equivalent, has become a proxy for politicians and public figures' commitment to anti-racism. And of course, some of the most far right-wing politicians and public figures, Viktor Orban, to name one, dangerously mobilize anti-Semitism, all of course with the support of Israel and the mainstream Jewish community, because of their shared Zionism and Islamophobia, the two going hand in hand. And I think this has real life violent repercussions for Jewish people. So just in terms of exceptionalizing anti-Semitism, today, I think remembrance of the Holocaust as a public ritual and a civic duty has eclipsed knowledge of any history of anti-Semitism. And that's why it's really useful to have had, well, Michael, you spoke about the history of Philosemitism, but we also need more public education about the history of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has, the long history of anti-Semitism has been reduced to the moment, or to, it wasn't a moment, but it's constructed in the public imaginary as a moment or as an event, the Shoah or the Holocaust, which is also seen as unique and aberrant. And there's little to no public understanding of the function of the Jew, like the Muslim and the Black, to use the, this kind of way of speaking, had historically for the racial formation of Europe. Constructing the Holocaust as unique and anti-Semitism as exceptional is actually central to how the official history of Europe is narrated. To place the Shoah in the context of a past and continuous present of race as intrinsic to the formation of colonial modernity and white European supremacy, as some scholars of genocide, such as Zoe Samudzi and others are arguing, would mean a real reckoning with its meaning for Europe and the West. And of course, these are echoes of Aimé Césaire, as Kieran mentioned. Instead, the Shoah is secured firmly in the past. And this is what I meant when I wrote about frozen racism, which comes from another argument that I made in another paper. And it therefore becomes a prototype for racism to which all other instances of racism can be compared and of course found lacking or not really racism. As I wrote, official top-down anti-racism sets anti-Semitism up as the threat to end all threats, with the purpose not of ending anti-Semitism, but of denying all other racisms within the racial state. So anti-Semitism has the role to actually negate other people's experiences of their own, the racism that they are faced with. In the public discourse, race and racism are not discussed as central to the history of Europe, essential to the development of, and spread of capitalism, or as a central technology of colonial rule. By detaching race, therefore, from the facts of history and the present day in this way, it is then reattached to racialized people who are now seen as the new racists, Black, brown, and particularly Muslim people. And of course, this is what Anna was speaking about in relation to how the war on anti-Semitism in Germany is being waged, but also in France and the UK and elsewhere. The racism of those of migrant origin in Europe is said to flow through their failure to integrate into the societies of their hosts, like the Jews have done. So often, again, somebody mentioned, why can't you be more like the Jews, right? And also about, I think it's a reaction against people's protest, right? So protesting in the wrong way against the discrimination and exploitation they face, which is why we have accusation of BLM and others of being anti-Semitic, because of their support for Palestinians. And of course, the event that precipitated the need for this panel was, of course, the recent invitation of Tzipi Hotovely to the LSE and all of the discussion of what that protest was like afterwards, which I don't need to reiterate. But of course, the recitation of objection to anti-Semitism from representatives of the British state, such as Priti Patel, who tweeted in support of Hotovely, doesn't translate into actual concern for Jews. The hypocrisy of those who claim to care about Jews while enacting racist policy isn't an error. I think it's by design. But I think it's also important to say that pointing out hypocrisy in general when it comes to anti-racism is a distraction, because of course racism is always filled with double standards. Once we stop dwelling on that and understand the particular political function of the fixation with Jews and anti-Semitism today, then I think we can start to undo the harm that's being done to anti-racism. So in this regard, Philosemitism, which of course is a false love for Jews, plays an important role in the exceptionalization of anti-Semitism. Philosemitism, while nominally protecting Jews, always casts us as outsiders and borders on the obsessional. A major thinker for me in terms of what Philosemitism is Horia Butelja, who has theorized what she calls a state Philosemitism, which functions to deny any discussion of racism, Islamophobia, or any form of structural racism. Anti-Semitism is responded to by exaggerated philosemitic attitudes by which Jews are once again transformed into caricatures. State Philosemitism emerged, of course, as Kieran said, when Europeans realized that they had applied colonialist procedures on its own soil. So then decontextualized and depoliticized, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust have been recast, not as a trauma for Jews, but as a trauma at the heart of whiteness and at the heart of the nation. If Philosemitism meant actual love for Jews, then of course it would include us, anti-Zionist Jews, Black Jews and Jews of color, and all of those who don't fit into the template of what the modern Jewish subject of the post-Holocaust is supposed to look like. As the French Jewish anti-colonialist Simon Assoun writes, state Philosemitism takes independent agency away from Jews and squeezes us between the forces of power and the popular masses. State Philosemitism and the war on anti-Semitism have been used to justify more and more repressive laws. One recent example is the French law against separatism. You may have heard that this law allows for anyone who disrespects the so-called values of the Republic, the French Republic, naming radical Islamism in particular, to be imprisoned for 3 years or face a fine of 45,000 euro. The president, Emmanuel Macron, thinks that this law is necessary due to the failure of integration of migrants, again, the link between anti-Semitism and a failure of multiculturalism or integration, and as he put it, our fight against discrimination and racism, such as anti-Semitism, which he singles out, which have bred, as he put it, our enemy. Here, he's singling out anti-Semitism among racism, all racisms, and claims that it was the failure to act against it which created the conditions for the assassination of the school teacher Samuel Paty, who actually himself was not Jewish, but which precipitated his assassination, precipitated the apparent need for this new law. The France Fanon Foundation, of course, has said about the law that it is a new demonstration of the coloniality of power, targeting racialized communities who are already disproportionately punished and policed. So by setting Jews up as a community to be defended from so-called separatist Muslims, the law drives a further wedge between Jews and other racialized people with whom, of course, we should be in solidarity against both state and popular racisms. So we can see that the fight against anti-Semitism acts as a proxy for a real opposition to racism, with even right-wing actors being able to portray themselves as the true anti-racist because of their performative opposition to anti-Semitism. Concern with anti-Semitism, which, as I said, is seen as equivalent to anti-Zionism and associated with Muslim minorities and decolonial activists and thinkers, rather than with the European elites with whom it originates, is then used to justify repressive state action against racialized communities and to whitewash state racism. So on the one hand, anti-Semitism has become a tool with which to disarm political opposition from the left. And on the other, anti-Semitism is a mere weapon whose mention automatically triggers distrust. And this was, I think, the simplistic binary presented in the so-called anti-Semitism crisis during the Jeremy Corbyn leadership of the Labour Party, which we can maybe get into later. This affair reminded me that Jews, both for anti-Semites and for those who manipulate anti-Semitism for other than anti-racist ends, are what David Smith has called ghostly walking tropes. In other words, they are representations of people, not people per se. So the swing between the outright dismissal of anti-Semitism and its manipulation in the interests of states or political actors is obviously of no service to me as a Jewish person, which is what I didn't want to say. The constant attack and counterattack in the war on anti-Semitism leads to us getting caught in the question of whether anti-Semitism is real or an imaginary weapon. Turning anti-Semitism into a matter of debate has detrimental effects on both Jews, ourselves, and obviously on the potential for us to build solidarities with other racialized peoples. So actually, none of this is a debate about racism or anti-Semitism at all. Rather, it's a proxy through which those within institutions struggle for power. The question, I think, shouldn't be, does anti-Semitism exist, or is it more or less threatening than other forms of racism? Anti-Semitism obviously exists because the extent to which it is a core ideology at the heart of Euromodernity hasn't been confronted, just as there is a general refusal to confront race as an ongoing political force in the public sphere. So the very posing of these questions from either side of the political divide serves as a way to avoid confronting the effects of race, coloniality, and racism at both the local and the global level. So where does this leave us? And I'll come to an end. In my book, I argue that there are two forms of anti-Semitism, both good and bad. And there are also good and bad Jews. Bad anti-Semitism is presented as real. It exists among the far right, the far left, and Muslims. In contrast, good anti-Semitism, that of elites, which treats Jews as a racialized subaltern group in service to the state, is left unchallenged. So the kind of anti-Semitism that we are concerned with, nobody cares about. Bad Jews are those who refuse to allow anti-Semitism to be instrumentalized in the service of racial rule. We are anti-Zionist and therefore struggle against racism in all its forms. And I wrote that the bad Jew who refuses to sit in her place is the thorn in the side of the racial state. So anti-colonialist Jews acting collectively must work to undermine the role that we are assigned under globalized racial rule. And to end also on a positive note, which I think is important, I was really enthused by Santiago Slobodski's call in his book, Decolonial Judaism, for Jews to return to what he provocatively calls our barbarian roots, the roots that attach us to other racially exploited peoples. Although white Jews cannot merely deny the role that we play in structural whiteness and Euro-American hegemony, as M. Cohen has pointed out, we can and we must align ourselves with the anti-colonial, anti-racist struggle and refuse to participate in whitewashing attacks on anti-colonial resistance in the false name of protecting Jews. Thanks.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Lana. I think that was like all the speakers, that was really good and important. Yeah, and really valuable. So yeah, if now I think it would be, yeah, obviously good to move on to the kind of discussion part of the event. So I think the best way to do this would be, yeah, if people do have kind of thoughts and questions, either they can either there's the chat box, they can put it in there and we'll take a look at that, and Josie and I'll, you know, sort them out, or if people could yeah, raise their hands. I think, yeah, you use the Zoom function to raise their hands, and then I can we can come to them and see what they've got to say. Obviously, it would be great as well if the people who've spoken, obviously I expect you have kind of thoughts on what's been said as well. So obviously, yeah, if there are thoughts you have, that would be fantastic as well. Yeah. So yeah, let's see if anyone's going to raise their hand. And yeah, I was saying this before to people that I'm also aware, like sometimes with events of this sort, particularly if like the speakers are really good, which of course everyone has been, sometimes it can make like people in the audience a bit shyer about speaking, but yeah, everyone's very nice, so please, yeah, so please, if people have contributions, that would be really interesting. to hear from everyone.
Do the speakers want to unmute as well?
Yeah, it might be useful if speakers are muted at the very least.
That would be super cool. Have you got a question to get the ball rolling, Tom?
I have a sort of vague thing if nobody else.
I
have a vague. Oh, Kieran.
Kieran.
Only if yours might be more interesting than mine, most probably. But in terms of like developing, I guess, a kind of like praxis of this, I mean, I've been thinking in the amazing things that everybody's been saying. And well, one of the things that I think is important in some of these debates, and I saw when Alana brought up about the Labour Party, Michael shaking his head because I don't want to talk about any of that stuff either. It obscures more, I think. But I guess in terms of like discussing like relations of Palestine and anti-Zionism, and anti-Zionism as part of like our anti-racist praxis, I'm interested to hear people's thoughts on the ways in which I think sometimes in relation to this, anti-Zionism can end up. There's a good article on this, I think it's with Max Isle and some others. They're talking about how the idea that anti-Zionism is kind of just about anti-Palestinian racism, when actually I think that obscures its broader relations, not only in its embedding in kind of like European, particularly French and British kind of imperial endeavors like Michael was talking about, but the ways that Zionism also operates, and we can see this with kind of British state Philosemitic Zionism, that it also operates to racialize Jewish people too, and the ways in which we're kind of talking about it. That as well as racializing Palestinians, it needs to be, if our practice is not one of engaging in the kind of what Alana was talking about with, oh, is it that anti-Semitism exists or not, but actually recognizing that as a proxy, and that actually our practice must illuminate the operations of race, must also recognize that and work to illuminate the fact that Zionism operates to racialize Jewish people too. I think it was Xavier talking about the ways in which, like, when you had non-Ashkenazi Jews going to places like Israel, they're part of a racializing structure, right? They're part of a racializing class structure too. This is something that me and Ron have been speaking about as well, who I see in the audience. But yeah, and the ways in which if we're going to recognize a challenge to Philosemitic kind of anti-Semitism, what are people's thoughts on the kind of need for an anti-Zionism, and also to recognize that anti-Zionism is also a form of opposing anti-Semitism too, as well as obviously broader imperial relations.
Yeah, I think one of the aspects that often gets missing, I think not just in terms of like talking about anti-Zionism, but a lot of anti-racist kind of discourse more broadly, is that most conversations tend to be quite delinked from what it would look like to be liberated and what liberation would look like and feel like. And instead it kind of ends up on this terrain of quite discrete, small kind of instances of racism or colonialism that is kind of delinked from the wider project of A, liberation, B, what actually like holds all of us together. What is it that means that we're not free? And how does that operate if you're Jewish or if you're Black or if you're Palestinian? And that's true of a lot of the conversations around anti-Zionism, but a lot of anti-racist discourse more broadly. I think that it is absolutely critical to center the need for Jews to organize based on their own liberation and understand that they're organizing as anti-Zionists. And myself as a Jewish anti-Zionist, I organize based on my own liberation from racism and from, the racism and anti-Semitism that, keeps reproducing this. And that through that, understanding it that way, that I understand it not as a, oh, I'm doing this as a favor, or I've got this kind of, this kind of obligation as a Jew with family in Israel to speak up. That's a one-way system. It has to be based on solidarity, and you have to understand it as we all, if there's any obligation, it's to make sure that we are all free and understand what it means to get to being free. And so, yeah, I think, in conversations around anti-Zionism, I think that aspect is really missing. And I think what's interesting is, we can talk about, Bundist understandings of anti-Zionism, and they're, the Bund who were organizing as, Ashkenazi Jewish political project in sort of Eastern Europe, like 100 more years ago, that was a diasporic project that was about, not about, entrenching these racialized ideas. That wasn't about a colonial project. And it wasn't just, at that point, Palestine, Israel did not exist as a project, but even the proposal on the table was rejected by socialists. It was rejected by anti-Zionists before what we understand to be Zionism now, because they wanted to see a project that was based on solidarity for all oppressed peoples, not just for Jews. And I think it's worth remembering that we have a long history of censoring those kinds of ideas in our anti-Zionism and our anti-racism more broadly.
Thank you. And I think, oh, sorry. Yeah, so Mike, and I think Anna wanted to talk too. So if we have Mike, then Anna, is that good?
I think Anna was first.
Anna?
No, it's fine. I can talk after you, Michael. It's fine.
Okay. I think just from what Avia was saying, I think it's important to say that not just Jewish socialists, but the vast majority of Jews in general were not persuaded by the idea of Zionism. Zionism as an idea was around for a very long time. And even in the worst circumstances, I think 2 to 3 million Jews fled pogroms in Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1914, and fewer than 3% of those Jews ended up in Palestine as some of the early kind of settlers. So I think something that's maybe sometimes been missing from, I don't want to mention the dreaded debates, like Labour anti-Semitism debates, but some of the debates within the left around these ideas is that Israel doesn't exist without European anti-Semitism, and it doesn't exist without the Holocaust, and it doesn't exist without that kind of without those relations which still exist in all Western societies, including lots of people on the left, and that's been a kind of an issue that we've had to kind of wrestle with. Yeah.
Perfect. And then Anna?
Yeah, I thanks for Avia's comment, actually, and intervention. I was wondering also with Michael's last comment right now, whether Israel is a direct or is a consequence of the Shoah. I think that is how dominant discourse narrates it very often on a state level, but I would rather see it as a continuation of colonial displacements and population exchanges. And the Shoah or the Holocaust also against the Sinti and Roma was used as an event in time and space to justify it rather as the original source for it, maybe. But that's just.
I'm not saying it's the source, but if you look at how the migrations happened to get that mass migration of Jewish people onto Palestinian territories in those years is and also what's not recognized is the complete obliteration of the Jewish left and the Jewish working class in the Shoah. So it's these, I just think these are contextual to the discussion. That's all I mean.
Well, I think European or Russian Jews have for a very long time fled to Arab lands for rescue, actually, right? So it's not the first time that people kind of ended up in the British Empire, entity that we call Palestine today. But actually, I wanted to say something that links that a little bit to what was said before. I think discourse provides all of us, in a way, as subjects or people with certain, habits of narration or thinking, or how we understand and conceptualize the past, the present, the future. And what I find very difficult in that, coming from my own field research, basically researching predominantly 99% only white, non-Jewish Germans talking about anti-Semitism for 1.5 years, I noticed that what we are basically dealing with when it comes to discourse is essentially a white narcissism that is incapable almost to see. I see Alana really nodding like yes, that has no conceptualization of what the colony means or is, how it provided Europe with its material and intellectual means of today, and therefore also because of this discourse of this habit of narrating things in a certain way, it's not necessarily conscious intention. It's literally people don't know, and then they end up on kind of boards, chalkboards or whiteboards in the background to dissect anti-Semitism in 8 to 9 categories, which is by now a common standard, in fact, in any kind of educational tool, actually, by now in Germany, when it comes to anti-Semitism. So we're very far away from what Alana calls for, not defining it. We're still in this very old colonial mentality of dissecting, naming, claiming, and categorizing, and therefore utilizing and weaponizing what the other comes to stand in. And it's true, it's not actually the Jew, right? It's a figuration of Jewishness that is used to then argue about the colony. And that's the interesting fact, I think, that I find the most interesting one, that this white narcissism essentially weaponizes or uses figurations of Jewishness, white European Jewishness, Ashkenazi history, in fact, only, to make an argument about the colony that is a ghost that does not exist, but poses a phantasmatic threat of takeover, which is also an old anti-Semitic trope, right, which was projected. So yeah, that's all I wanted to actually say. And that maybe we can understand Philosemitism. People have argued that Philosemitism was beneficial for Jews to survive, on the other hand. And that might be a stark or a strong statement, but I think we should kind of think through that when we think of changing dialectics, material dialectics right now, especially when it comes to a population of European Jewry that is today predominantly, at least in Germany, not anti-Zionist, at least.
Oh, brilliant, thank you. So we've got a really interesting question in the chat, but can I just check if maybe any of our speakers want to kind of add anything to this aspect of the discussion, or if we should move on to the next question?
I might add and then go on to the question from Riaz, because it's something that I've done a lot of work on. I think what Avia said, I mean, what everybody said is really important, but I really want to pick up on what you said, Avia, in relation to our own liberation. But I do think that we need to start having the uncomfortable conversations about whether or not that's something that is shared by our accomplices always. I do, and this was what I was referring to when I was talking about I was uncomfortable about speaking as a Jew, and now I'm uncomfortable about the reaction to the blog post about speaking as a Jew. Because I do feel that white anti-Zionist Jews have been given a role within, and maybe that's fair, maybe that's fair. We do benefit from it, a huge advantage within the structures of racial capitalism, etc. But I also don't think that it's something that is sustainable to play this role of putting aside our own liberation, of putting that on the back burner and not making that part and parcel of the struggle. Because ultimately what it constantly means is that you can be questioned, your legitimacy can be questioned. And this is quite frankly something that I constantly face. My anti-Zionism is constantly questioned by those who just cannot quite believe it, because in the racialization of Jews, and Anna's completely right, the majority of Jews are Zionists still, despite, I think there's a backlash, but it's insufficient. But there is a problem in denying people the right to self-identify because of this doubt, this constant doubt that what you're saying is actually true. And actually you're going to pull this out of your hat, your actual true identity, which is a Zionist and a racist one. Yeah. And this is something that I think we need to have frank discussions with our comrades about. How can we really engage in a project of common liberation that still is cognizant of the fact that as a white Jew, I have more benefits, advantages, and privileges than, Black people, Palestinian people, people of color, etc. And I think it's possible, but I think it needs to be actively spoken about. And I don't think we're actively speaking about it at the moment. Yeah. So that's just one thing on that. And that's why I find it really helpful that you said that. On the question in the chat from Riaz, so he wants to know about Barner Hesse's, he gave a talk about white sovereignty and the central place that World War II has taken in the conception of racism. And I've used Barner's work a lot over the years. Barner examined my PhD thesis, so go back a long time. And in the second chapter of my book, what I did was to take up his argument, which is basically that the way in which we understand racism today is based in a Eurocentric definition that cannot encapsulate, sorry, I'm really tired, cannot encapsulate the totality of the project of racial rule in colonial settings. And he says that race is ultimately colonially constituted. So it kind of is worked out in context of colonial domination. But that this doesn't come into the definition of racism. And so what I did in order to kind of go deeper into that argument was to use the work of a French historian called Carole Reynaud-Paligot. And she did this really, really interesting research into the history of French physical anthropologists who call themselves anti-racist. So racism as a term is first coined by racists themselves to describe their projects. I'm talking about kind of racial science types, in the early, the late 19th and early 20th century. But it kind of comes into its own in the 1920s and 1930s when people started to talk about racism in order to oppose it, right? So she looked at these French physical anthropologists who were doing work around the concept of race. And these were all people who were doing racial experimentation, right? But they came to understand, or they came to believe, that you couldn't really make distinctions among white people. So until this point, you had a whole kind of categorization of various racial groups within the European context, like the Slavs were not the same as the Nordics, were not the same as the Southern Europeans, etc. And they all had kind of racial names, right? Pseudo-science stuff, yeah? And this group said, well, this doesn't really sustain itself. We don't really see enough kind of differentiation biologically or genetically between these people in order to make this case. And even Jews should be brought into the one white race, right? So we just talk about a European race. We're not going to talk about these different races. But what she shows is that these people, at the same time as making this argument, and for example, even starting a journal called Race and Racisms, which was an anti-racist journal, self-professed anti-racist journal, a number of them continue to carry out racial experimentation on colonized peoples, right, in Africa and elsewhere, right? And so what she's trying to show is that these two things, this anti-racism, this Eurocentric anti-racism, is completely consistent with colonial domination and indeed even, the practice of racial science. So then when we look at what Barner Hesse has written, I think this evidence supports his argument that the dominant way in which we understand racism is not fit for purpose. In other words, it cannot be extended for use when we talk about the majority of racialized or negatively racialized peoples in the world under systems of racial rule you know, under colonialism, etc. So there's a lot more to his argument, but that's kind of a nutshell so that we don't go too much off topic. But I think it is useful because that's how you have anti-Semitism becoming the kind of the main definition around which all other forms of racism have to kind of, you know, organize themselves. So anti-Semitism is the example, the prototype, and everything else is compared. And as I said, is found lacking. So this isn't really racism because it doesn't look like the Holocaust, because that's our one example of what racism is supposed to look like. And, you know, some others, the apartheid often comes into it, Jim Crow, slavery, and slavery will come into it as well. But in the European context, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, the two having been reduced to each other, is of course the main thing.
Wonderful, thank you, Alana. I think that was really valuable.
Do any other panelists want to come in on that, or indeed any other participants? I think it's quite an interesting topic, actually.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting if other people had contributions to make around this. Anybody?
Oh, message
Do you
in
have
the
something
chat.
in the
Someone asking for the French academic's name. Meetings, hell.
check? So yeah, did anyone
I
else
just put it in the chat.
Wonderful.
Did anyone else want to come in around that or have anything else to add for now?
Cool. Shall we move on? Or? Yes.
Cool.
There's Kieran.
Kieran might have something to say, so let's unmute Kieran.
Where's he gone? There he is.
Yeah, so I have to keep on muting because my baby brother's taking a bath. So yeah. I just wanted to. I thought it was interesting bringing up on Ronit's point as well, and I think this is what I've kind of drawn from everybody's kind of interventions on that. Is that again, as Ronit pointed out in the chat, Zionist leaders such as Hertz and others welcomed anti-Semitism. I think it was from your book, Ronit, actually, that it was one of the lead writers of. Can't remember it in particular, but it was a particular basically Zionist Jewish magazine, and the editor basically says in order to be a good Zionist, one has to be a bit of an anti-Semite, and I think I think what Lana was saying about this kind of not quite trusting Jewish anti-Zionists, which is like unfortunately an element of like anti-Semitism on the left. I guess trying to think of like, forms of praxis for this and how we can like develop forms of praxis of this is, I guess, is trying, because this is the thing that I wanted to kind of us to try and collectively figure out, right? Like how in all this amazing stuff that everybody's coming out with, these experiences, these histories, these relations of anti-Semitism to anti-Black racism, to anti-Palestinian racism, how can we, develop forms of praxis that can actually work not only to illuminate this, but actually to form solidarities and political interventions from the left on this issue, right? How can we expose to people that, yes, Zionism is a racial colonial project, but is also one that is linked to anti-Semitism. Is also one to the racialization of the Jew. I think what the point that Alana made was kind of spoke to me heavily and linked to everybody else's points is about the Shoah is a trauma, but it's not for Jews, it's for white Europeans. And I think that gets to so much of this, right? I imagine everybody probably saw where a bunch of our favorite white non-Jewish liberals all were provided with trees to be planted in Israel, right? And some of these people, I'm not going to name any names, but some of these people I'd actually seen essentially do race science, basically being like, we're Ashkenazi Jewish people, XYZ, something about get diseases more easily or something like that. Literally doing like racial biology, but in the notion of protecting Jewish people. And I think it's getting to the heart of this issue is to recognize the ways in which these forms of philosemitic, forms of philosemitic anti-Semitism, which I think Zionism is one of the main ways in which it's used. So I don't know, a kind of vanguard maybe, but the way it runs so much deeper is essentially to protect whiteness, right? It's to deflect from the ongoing crimes such as Grenfell, bordering policies, Windrush. Like the way this is essentially to protect the consciousness of white Europeans. I think I'm just trying to, I guess, see what interventions do we think we can be practically doing now that work to try and both illuminate how race operates, right? Going back to Alana's quote that I always put on the meme, that like if this operates to not illuminate but to obscure the operations of race, what kinds of praxis and political interventions can we try and develop and generate that work to illuminate them as well as challenge them? I guess that would be what I want to hear from people.
I'm going to say that both Avia and Michael have written or said really interesting things on this. I'd love to hear from, particularly about the Black Jewish Alliance, and also Michael, some more thoughts from you, from your notes, which were just brilliant.
Yeah, if either one of you want to come in, that would be really sound.
I'm happy to. Well, I guess it's in answer to what Kieran was just saying. I think if we look at practical sort of examples of things that have happened recently, I think when we're talking about political education within our movements, people will often probably think of, things like this or reading groups, or which are all like great. And I think, I'm sad I haven't come to any of your reading groups because they sound great, but I already read some of them. So, but if we look at what happened in the summer of 2020, it shows that struggle itself is actually the best kind of political education. I think if you look at what happened when Colston was toppled, that kind of act where a kind of a whole crowd of differently racialized people came together and took direct action, that forced a kind of reckoning with the history of Bristol, the history of England before Britain existed, the kind of racial capitalist origins of England. I think that shows that so often when we're living in times of kind of very intense rupture and flux, where there's openings for kind of assaults on the state, for struggle to be formed, for people's kind of subjectivity to be reshaped. It happens in struggles where the kind of pace of time, where people's kind of conceptions of what's possible shift, and that's where I think alliances can be made, but also where that kind of education takes place. And even as imperfect as social media is, so many people, I'm so massively impressed with especially people who are younger than me in their 20s, and how much kind of further along they are than I ever was at that age, and how kind of hungry they are for like critiques and for kind of comradely discussions. And I think that kind of stuff is so valuable and is already happening. Yeah.
I was going to speak a little bit about the Black Jewish Alliance, which I guess kind of started as a loose collection of, few Black Jews and, white Jews and Black non-Jews who would just, initially just have, hanging out, having Shabbat dinners and talking politics. and kind of developed through that. And I think Shabbat's quite an interesting space. If you're a left-wing Jew, it can be quite generative in a lot of ways, like the spiritualism, but also the space to kind of reflect and think and talk, not organizing, but just to kind of reflect on things, and over time it kind of developed into a kind of shared vision of, what I was talking about before, about understanding our different positions, as Black people, as Black Jews, as non-Black Jews. What is our kind of collective vision, and what is our vision, for liberation, and how does, racial capitalism operate, and like understanding our histories and where they interlink and where they interweave, and like what our vision actually is. Because I definitely think that there are differences between different communities or different groups of people in how that plays out in terms of who's more privileged and who isn't. But fundamentally, none of us are safe under capitalism. None of us are safe under racial capitalism. And I think, none of us can, even if we become a bit more privileged materially at some point for our lives, that's not the same as safety, and it's not the same as liberation. And so, through those conversations, it just, kind of developing that kind of shared vision, it got to a point where we wanted to share our reflections, our thoughts, like invite more people to come on board. And I mean, it's very early doors, but it's like, it's quite an, we just started a Twitter account, and within a day or so, we had like 1,500 followers. And then it kind of became kind of like, it's so interesting how much appetite there was for this kind of discussion around alliances between different communities and across different communities. There just seemed to be so much appetite for that, which we weren't aware that was going to happen. We thought maybe 10 or 20 people might follow us, and we might just have some hot takes. And I think that it feels like there are some people who are ready to start furthering the conversation of like our anti-racist praxis, and getting a little bit deeper and a little bit getting a little bit sharper, and actually sharing that between us. I guess, like, watch this space.
Fantastic, thank you. I think this is really valuable and really hopeful too, actually, which is good. So just checking if any of the other speakers or anyone else wants to kind of respond to that or come in around those questions. Mike's got his hand up. Yeah, should we unmute Mike and then
there we go.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I wanted to say to Via is I'm not surprised that there was that reaction, because I think, I've probably had like quite a lot of things to say about things around kind of Corbynism and stuff about anti-Semitism over the years and online, and I've tried to be kind of pretty balanced about things, I guess. But I guess my main takeaway is that whilst I've kind of experienced some terrible kind of like anti-Semitism from people claiming to be on the left or Corbynites, I think my majority experience has been that like people have been really kind of like interested and willing to learn and humble, and people have gone away and done their own work. And in some ways this kind of thing has been foisted onto the left in some ways without without basis, in some instances without basis, but people have really made that effort to understand and have kind of, you know, these elements of the Jewish community, which, like, to be honest with you, like, you know, as someone who is Jewish from my mum's side, and my mum and her family are American, so I feel no connection to kind of British Jewish community whatsoever, and my knowledge about it is very limited, and I don't have kind of personal connections to it. So my kind of experience of the British Jewish community has been developed through this kind of constant sort of crisis mode, where, you know, it's being represented by communal organizations or by Jewish Chronicle or by some of the very worst people, Jewish or non-Jewish, in the public sphere. And I think that there's been a hunger from Jews and non-Jews on the left to learn more and to know that the Jewish community is more diverse than what is presented to them, and to want to get to know that. And I think that's been a positive aspect of it.
Great. Do we have anything else on this? Because this, I mean, at least on a sort of practical level, feels like at least like one of the kind of crucial questions that might come out of this. So yeah, do we have anything else around this from any of the speakers, or any kind of wider responses?
Oh, Alana's there. Alana's
yeah.
there.
I was just going to say that I think, you know, the kinds of things that Anna was talking about in terms of policy are just going to increase. I think Germany is setting the trend. Here in Australia, we just had the IHRA definition being adopted like a month ago, when it hadn't been until this point. Yeah, this is at the level of the government, of the federal government, and a number of organizations like universities, etc. And I think obviously having those collective solidarity building experiences on a local level where possible is extremely important. And I do agree with Michael that ultimately political education happens through struggle. But I also think that we need a level of organization to combat what's happening at the policy level that takes into account this kind of sophisticated critique. Because what I see in the way in which the IHRA definition, for example, is being lobbied against, I don't see many of these arguments being made. And I see, you know, for example, and this is maybe controversial, but one of the reactions to the IHRA was a demand for the definition of anti-Palestinian racism. And many, yeah, right. So many, I don't know, actually, I'd love to know what you think, Anna, but I know, for example, that Palestinian comrades here have put it to me that this is not a useful way to go, in the same way that I would argue that, you know, a definition of anti-Semitism that is non-relational is not a useful way to go. But that's been a dominant response, yeah? And so it's a further splitting off rather than an attempt to think relationally and globally about race as a project of rule. It again, you know, remobilizes the Eurocentric definition of racism and tries to apply it to other populations for whom it wasn't considered initially. And so we go on in this kind of vicious cycle. So what I really think that we need is some kind of global entity, I don't know, like counter-organization, counter-attack strategy that is able to hold all of these quite complex ideas together and mobilize on that basis. But how we do it practically is, you know, obviously something that we need to discuss.
And then, did you? If you'd like.
Yeah, the anti-Palestinian racism definition is, yeah, I mean, it's quite en vogue, I would say, especially about amongst maybe legal practitioners or, well, yeah, I think legal practitioners predominantly. I do believe that definitions, maybe that's also a strong statement now, serve more or less liberal rules or liberal forms of rule in a way that, you know, serve bureaucracy and essentially, to my mind, a project of reform. And so there's nothing bad or inherently bad about, you know, reforming something, I guess. But I think if we already talk about the history of racial capitalism, we also hopefully come to understand that there needs to be done more than just reforming the system. And I think what Alana said before, or where we are right now in these debates, is what I see is basically we're facing three big bulks of discussions. And one discussion would be the intra-Jewish debate on Zionism that has been debated a little bit. Then the policy level, the IRA definitions, and how states basically weaponize anti-Semitism generally, not only Philosemitism, I guess. And the third one then is how do we link all of that back to some sort of allyship between the Jewish community and the people of color community, trends or globally, right? So it's like these three things at the same time that need to be tackled as fast as possible, because I do believe that capitalism, especially in that time right now with COVID, is just accelerating, and the thing with the planet also doesn't really look good. So I think we're moving into a future where we are also fighting for survival, essentially. So I think racial capitalist term that we are now debating right now also serves along the project of securing, you know, a certain sense of stability, maybe not safety, as Avia already said, but for the future. So we need to work fast, maybe, yeah.
So I think we're probably coming towards an end now, but we do have one more question in the chat that if people can see around, yeah, the kind of usefulness around trying to break down the hegemonic position of Zionism within diaspora Jewish communities. So perhaps if any of our speakers have something to say on this, that would be great. And then maybe we could, maybe it might be time, unfortunately, actually, to kind of move on to kind of bring this to a close.
Who wants?
I could say something, but I've spoken a lot, so. Somebody else has something to say. What do you want me to say? Yeah.
Maybe Alana, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just say something really brief. I obviously think it's really important, right? And I think it's happening. And I think there are many younger Jews who are, you know, coming to realize that Zionism is no salvation, and it's at odds with our anti-racism. But I really think that there's a problem in partly in some of the way it's being done, and I think part of how the kind of the pushback against Zionism from within Jews and Israelis is happening is still within a liberal Zionist framework, and still focuses on the exceptional status of particularly brave individuals, like, for example, conscientious objectors and so on, right? And I think this goes hand in hand with the inability to actually think about Jews as separate to Zionism. Like, we haven't completed that piece yet. So the traditions that Avia was speaking about in terms of socialist Judaism and the general kind of rejection of Zionism that existed prior to the establishment of the state for the majority of the history of Jewry is not something the majority of people know. So then it becomes this enormously brave and courageous and, you know, thing to do, to stand up against Zionism, as though this entire history of diasporic Jewry didn't really exist, right? And it's always been about the cementing together of Jews and Zionism, or Jews and the state of Israel. And it leads again to this exceptionalization of Jews. So this idea of be more like the Jews, right? And I just don't think that's a useful way to do any kind of anti-racism, in the same way that people have engaged in criticism of celebrity anti-racist or celebrity, race thinkers, etc. I just think it's not viable on the long term. It elevates certain voices while kind of dampening down or diluting an entire history of struggle on which we could draw. And I think part of this, the problem that leads to this, is the fact that we don't have a good understanding of either the history of diasporic Jewry or the history of anti-Semitism, which I alluded to before. So more political education, and I think then the fight against Zionism within the diaspora will be more effective and more solidaristic.
Fantastic. Thank
Excuse
you.
me for banging in the background, if you can hear that.
No, thank you.
Sorry.
Anyone have any additional thoughts on that?
No, so I think we're coming up to 10 when we said we'd end this. So maybe if we could go around the speakers very quickly just to see if they have any kind of concluding remarks. If anyone would like to start with that.
Anyone got any final thoughts?
We need to unmute Kieran again, don't we?
We do. There we go.
Yeah, I just want to say, thank you again to you guys for hosting this space and all the other speakers coming in. I think it's been really, really generative. And yeah, I just want to, I'll probably quote Michael on Twitter later saying about struggle itself is the best kind of political education. I think that's absolutely vital to this, right? And we need to be thinking about the ways in which our forms of struggle, I guess getting to what Alana was just saying, about some of the problems and the ways in which anti-Zionism has been confronted in Jewish diaspora, but I guess even more broadly as well, is that we need to be thinking about the relationality of race. We need to be understanding what racism is, its relationship more broadly to racial capitalism, and thinking about the ways in which our anti-Zionism and anti-racism must be both more broader and also work to, as I've kind of banged on about, illuminate the ways in which this kind of philosemitic anti-Semitism is being deflected from ongoing crimes of the British state, ongoing crimes of Israel, ongoing crimes of British imperialism. Yeah, that's what I'd say. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Do we want to just close it off? Or?
Any other?
Oh.
Yeah, let me.
Yep, Avia's got one. There we go.
I can unmute. Is that working on the meeting? Perfect.
Yeah, just to say that, the Black Jewish Alliance is planning on having some open events in the new year. So if you follow us on Twitter, check it out. Yeah, that's it.
Amazing.
And Alana said she's fine. And Michael, Anna? Do you want to?
Okay. Well, I would.
Should we have Anna first and then Mike? Anna.
Well, thanks to the organizers for inviting me and for Alana to probably suggest that. And what I like the most right now is not only the conversations that we're having together, but also that it's transnational. And I think whatever we will do in the future is more transnational alliances and across ethnic and migrant communities and the colonized, or formerly colonized, as a way to go. I think that would be my last comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And Michael?
Yeah, no, I definitely echo that. I think, we're talking about kind of practical organizing, and I think in terms of historically, the most effective forms of anti-racist organizing that have happened in Britain specifically have been sort of autonomous, sort of self-active anti-racists operating outside political institutions and parties generally, and they have those kinds of conditions have also allowed some of the best critiques of how racism is defined by the state and pushing back against those. And a lot of the victories that were won in, especially in the 70s and 80s by anti-racist movements here, have been progressively undermined by what's come since. And so a lot of those battles that we need about moving away from individualized notions of racism and from ideas that anti-racism can happen within the nation and within the borders are some of the biggest sort of things that we need to tackle in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mike. And yeah, just to and thank you everyone. I think thanks to all the speakers. I think that was fantastic, and thanks to everyone for coming and for the kind of questions and the participation. I think that was really valuable. I hope everyone else found it as useful as I did. So thank you everyone, and hopefully again this is a kind of like area of discussion we can carry on a bit in New Socialist as well. I think we should be having a really great interview with Anna coming up soon, so that should be really good. Really looking forward to that. And yeah, then this is like work we'd like to continue. And I think more generally, I think like this is kind of first political education event that we've done as New Socialist, and I think apologies for the like odd technical problem, but I think you know that I think it went well, and so yeah, this is definitely like the kind of thing we'd be really keen on doing again. So thank you everyone for
thank you all so
coming.
much. Take care. Have a wonderful evening or day if you're Alana. Thank you all so much. See you again soon.